Why does a 20-year-old sprint through backyard darkness with a stolen Glock and a borrowed wig? How does a single shot ricochet through a family, a police department, and 2 decades of courtrooms? And what makes a condemned man ask for Olive Garden when the clock finally stops ticking? Tonight, we crack open the case of Benjamin Donnie Ritchie, a life that veered from broken childhood to lethal injection, leaving an echo that still rattles Beech Grove, Indiana. Benjamin was born on May 30th, 1980, 2 weeks early and already bruised by circumstance. He never met his father. His mother, Marion Martin, danced in clubs under neon lights, surviving on tips and whatever substances kept the nights blurred. Alcohol seeped into her pregnancy. Cocaine chased it. And by the time Benjamin was 3, she had walked out on him twice, each time promising she'd be back when life got better. It never did. He fought teachers, set off fire alarms, and by 9th grade, quit altogether. Trouble became routine. At 18, he landed in prison for burglary, an 8-year sentence that carved hard lines across his face. Friends noticed the wig he sometimes kept in his backpack. For a laugh, he said, though nobody ever saw him laugh. September 29th, 2000 unspooled like every other restless evening until a white van idled too long at a Shell station on Emerson Avenue. Keys dangling, engine running, temptation humming under the hood. 3 men slid in, Benjamin, Michael Greer, and Michael Moody, and a clerk's shout rose too late. The van vanished onto I-46-5, northbound toward the blank edges of Indianapolis. Less than an hour later, Officer Matthew Hickey, fresh out of training, ran the plates on a van that didn't belong. His voice crackled over dispatch. Sirens answered. Officers Robert Mercury and William Bill. Tony closed the gap, red lights painting the night. Benjamin at the wheel shoved the accelerator, but stolen engines don't run on luck. The van fishtailed off the asphalt, plowed through a chain-link fence, and slammed to a halt against a child's swing set in a quiet cul-de-sac. Doors flung wide. Greer tumbled onto the lawn and Hickey tackled him within seconds. Moody froze, hands in the air. Benjamin bolted. Bill Toney, a rookie with 2 years on the force, the badge no less bright, chased him through a maze of backyards. Dogs barked, porch lights flicked on, fences rattled as the 2 men vaulted over. Benjamin's heart hammered, but fear wasn't new. It had been his metronome since childhood. He felt the weight of probation, the weight of patrol cars behind him, the weight of that Glock he'd stuffed under his belt an hour before. Halfway through a yard littered with plastic toys, he spun. 5 shots cracked the suburban night. Bill's vest caught 4. The 5th punched just above the Kevlar, ripping into his upper chest. He squeezed off a single return shot, missed, and crumpled to the grass, eyes on the moon he would never see rise again. Tomorrow should have been his 32nd birthday. Instead, it became the date etched in stone beneath his name. Benjamin threw the wig and gun into a tangle of brush, vaulted another fence and vanished. Sirens converged. K-9 units fanned out. Neighbors peered from curtained windows. By dawn, more than 100 officers had sealed off Beech Grove. An anonymous tip pointed to a rundown bungalow on 17th Street. Inside, Benjamin sat on a sagging sofa, sweat-soaked shirt clinging to his skin, no longer running. He surrendered without a word, wrists offered to the cuffs that awaited him since birth. The cuffs clicked shut and the world felt suddenly silent, as if every police radio and barking dog had surrendered to exhaustion. Detectives ferried Benjamin to the Marion County lockup, where fluorescent lights hummed like insects and the air smelled of old coffee. Inside interrogation room 3, they laid out the evidence he had tried to bury in the dark. The 9mm Glock streaked with mud, the discarded wig still clinging to a few strands of grass, and the blood-soaked vest that had failed to save Officer Bill Toney. Benjamin said the shooting was an accident. He claimed the gun slipped, that it went off on its own as he ran. No one in the room believed him, least of all the young widow sitting just beyond the one-way glass, pressing a trembling hand to her belly where their third child would never be conceived. Bill's funeral drew a sea of badges that filled half of downtown Indianapolis, cruisers lining the streets like silent sentinels. Bagpipes wailed, flags folded with merciless precision, and a toddler clutched the peak of her father's hat, too young to understand why it no longer fit his head. That raw public grief hardened the resolve of prosecutors. Within weeks, they announced their intent to seek death, arguing that the murder of a police officer during a felony required the state's harshest sentence. Reporters camped on courthouse steps, chasing every scrap of drama, and the name Benjamin Ritchie became shorthand for cold-blooded betrayal. Trial preparations churned for 10 months. The defense assembled a portrait of a damaged boy cast adrift by a negligent mother, and a system that medicated more than it mentored. Psychiatric reports detailed bipolar swings, cognitive deficits, and impulse control forged in prenatal chaos. Yet the prosecution's case was grimly simple. 5 deliberate shots, a fleeing suspect, a street officer dead a day before his birthday. When jury selection began, Benjamin smirked at the cameras, a gesture that landed on front pages under headlines dripping with outrage. During opening arguments, he rocked gently in his chair, whispering jokes to his attorneys while D.D. Toney stared holes through his skull. Witnesses paraded one by one. Michael Greer testified in shackles, describing the stolen van and the moment Benjamin yanked the pistol free. Forensic analysts traced each bullet's path, marking the single round that sliced above Kevlar like a surgeon's scalpel. The defense tried to shift blame to panic. No intent, just fear. But the tattoo did more damage than any testimony. Fresh ink on Benjamin's neck read 37, Officer Toney's unit number, a morbid badge he could wear forever. Jurors recoiled. Some wiped tears. In less than 3 hours, they returned a verdict. Guilty on every count. Murder, auto theft, firearm possession, resisting arrest. The sentencing phase followed, raw as an open wound. D.D. Toney faced the man who had stolen her future and demanded justice measured in minutes of lethal chemicals. Defense lawyers begged for mercy, citing brain damage, fetal alcohol exposure, and a childhood stitched with abandonment. They spoke of a boy holding a plastic gun when he was 5, practicing shootouts with imaginary foes because real friends never stayed. The jury heard it all, filed out, and wrote Benjamin's destiny in ink as dark as the numbers on his neck. On August 14, 2001, he was sentenced to death. Indiana State Prison in Michigan City became his universe. A cell the size of a motel bathroom, concrete walls sweating in winter, a steel bunk bolted to the floor. Yet amid the steel and sorrow, an odd privilege existed. The prison ran a cat adoption program for death row inmates, believing small acts of care could calm violent currents. Benjamin chose a black and white stray with a crooked tail and named him Officer. The irony stung guards, but the warden allowed it. At night, the cat curled against the bars while Benjamin sketched comics on legal pads, each frame starring a man who could outrun bullets and outrun fate. Appeals stretched across years like slow, grinding gears. Attorneys argued ineffective counsel, questioned forensic angles, raised mental health flags, and pleaded that trauma had wired his brain for disaster before he could spell his own name. Courts listened, then denied. Outside those walls, the world spun forward. New wars, new phones, new presidents. Inside, time dripped. In 2012, A Swedish documentary aired a short segment on Indiana's death row. Watching from a living room couch in Gothenburg, Ivana Söderlund caught sight of Benjamin's hazel eyes and felt an inexplicable tug. She wrote him a letter. He wrote back, slowly, in careful block letters, about his cat, the lake he could almost smell through a narrow window, and a regret that kept him awake long after lights out. Their correspondence blossomed into monthly visits. Glass separated their fingertips, yet conversations stretched far beyond the wire mesh. Childhood stories, Swedish winters, the feel of freedom she promised he would never taste again. For Benjamin, the letters were oxygen. He read them aloud to Officer, who purred as if purring could rewrite destiny. Still, execution dates crept closer. Drug shortages, procedural reviews, and pandemic delays pushed the timetable back again and again, each reprieve a cursed blessing. In 2024, the state scheduled May 20th, 2025 as final and absolute. Benjamin spent his last spring planting tomato seeds in styrofoam cups, though he wouldn't live to taste the fruit. He requested a final visit with Ivana and his mother, who arrived trembling, mascara streaking. They spoke through scratched plexiglass until a guard tapped his watch. As she left, Marion pressed her palm to the glass. He mirrored the gesture, 2 lifelines divided by half an inch and 23 years of silence. 3 weeks before 0 hour, Benjamin penned his clemency plea. Pages of apology, circuits of remorse, lines about Officer Tony's daughters who grew up without a father. The parole board listened, but 5-0 recommended denial. Governor's signature came swift and stark. Execution would proceed. The prison chaplain asked about a final meal. Benjamin smiled, surprisingly soft, and said, "Give me the tour of Italy." Chicken parmigiana, lasagna, fettuccine alfredo, comfort foods from a restaurant chain where families laugh over endless breadsticks. Maybe he craved what ordinary feels like. Maybe he just missed salt and butter. Guards drove to Olive Garden, returned with steaming paper bags, and the smell of basil filled the death row corridor. Benjamin's final day began beneath a pale dawn that painted the razor wire silver. He fed Officer one last scoop of kibble, whispered a goodbye, and watched the cat vanish behind his bunk as guards approached. Shackles clicked over his ankles, lighter than the weight inside his chest. At processing, he signed the personal property log, then stepped into a quiet room where a priest murmured a short prayer about mercy and unfinished stories. Just after 6, steel doors opened onto the death chamber corridor. Kitchen staff had already wheeled in the tour of Italy. Chicken parmigiana slick with sauce, a fat wedge of lasagna, twirls of fettuccine rich with cream. Benjamin closed his eyes after each bite, as though storing taste in memory's deepest vault. He passed on dessert, saved his last sip of sweet tea for the moment the tray slid away. Midnight came fast. Witnesses filed behind glass, reporters, prosecutors, 2 somber deputies representing the Tony family and Ivana, clutching a folded letter he had written earlier that week. When the curtain lifted, Benjamin lay strapped to a gurney, IV lines blooming from each arm like gray vines. He turned his head toward the gallery, searched for one pair of familiar eyes, and found them. A small smile flickered. Asked for a final statement, he cleared his throat. "I love my family, my friends, and everyone who tried to believe there was something better in me. I pray Officer Tony's daughters find peace. I'm sorry." The drugs entered at 12:38 a.m. A ripple of phenobarbital, then potassium chloride. Within seconds, his eyelids fluttered. Within minutes, his chest stilled. A doctor checked the faint space where pulse should be and announced, "Time of death, 0:12:46. Outside, press lights snapped on. Inside, a nurse gathered the personal effects: 3 drawings, a Bible, and a neon-pink cat collar. Officer would be fostered by another inmate. History kept moving, but for Beech Grove, the echo of that single backyard gunshot finally quieted. What remains is the question every winding tragedy leaves behind. Could anyone have steered one shattered boy another way?